Hey everybody, today we're going to be discussing Jean Gebser. It would be impossible for me to completely do justice to Gebser in a single video, so this is just a simple introduction, more intended on pointing you towards one of the most underrated thinkers of the 20th century. Many people might have heard me use the term aperspectival. This is a Gebserian term and hopefully will make much more sense after watching this video. Gebser is a culture philosopher, a tradition that was very important to continental philosophy, that has very little relevance to the Anglos. Spengler is another culture philosopher of which Gebser is often framed as responding to, and all of this will make sense in a moment. So, Jean Gebser begins the text, The Ever-Present Origin, by announcing we are in a moment of crisis. In the past, we have seen worlds close at the beginning of new events. We can think of the Neolithic bringing an end to egalitarian hunter-gatherer society and bringing forth things like warrior cults, until the Bronze Age comes and we see a transition into the prototypes of urbanite microcosms that are cut off from the forces of nature, and we can see more recently the end of traditional society at the start of modernity, where monarchy is replaced with democracy and myth with ratio. So likewise, Gebser claims that today we are at the end of an epoch as well. People of every political orientation can feel it. The electricity is in the air, and this end of an epoch could mark an extinction event, or a fundamental change in how humans will live their lives on Earth, perhaps due to climate change, multiculturalism, capitalism, nuclear warfare. Everyone thinks that some entrenched aspect of society will have to go back in the box. But this ideological war we have found ourselves in represents the limits of ideology, where all sides are looking to another, thinking they have no place in the future. The Second Amendment supporter, the climate skeptic, the Islamist, they each have an ideology that believes itself to have a monopoly on seeing the world as it is out there. And their imperative is that this next epoch is defined by the submission of everyone to their ideology. This type of conflict resolution by which one perspectival orientation wins out over another, this worked very well in the past. The Germans had one such orientation, the Anglos another, and the friction between the two would resolve itself in 2 world wars, of which the Anglo came out on top. But now, in the age of globalization, where technology is becoming more and more pervasive and entrenched in our lifestyle, and there is no isolated population that can organize itself around a world vision and declare this perspectival imperium against others we had seen in the past, it seems perspective itself has reached its limits. So Gebser sees this new conflict as beyond the perspectival conflicts of the past. It is beyond morals, economics, politics, religion, or ideology. Gebser writes that this is a juncture of final decisiveness for life on Earth, and this waking catastrophe can only be overcome by overcoming ourselves, by realizing the whole and not the part, by learning what it means to become integral. To Gebser, our rescue from collapse will come from the emergence of a new formation of man's consciousness. The evidence of a new transition in the structure of human consciousness can be found in all types of contemporary art, culture, physics, science, and ways of expression, just as previous forms of consciousness could be discerned in past forms of expression. Which brings us to the crux of the ever-present origin. Man evolves his consciousness in accordance to his changing perspectival relationship to the world, and with it his whole experience of reality evolves and changes. There have been 4 past structures of consciousness, and we are now transitioning into the 5th. And the text lays out the model of the 5 structures of consciousness and then spends the later portion evidencing them through looking at art, the sciences, political history, and the appearances of each modality of consciousness in their contemporary expressions. So we have this demand for a new structure of consciousness that failing to meet will lead to a catastrophe. To illustrate a past example of such a catastrophe, Gebser begins the text with an analogy of the Mexicans when Europeans arrived in Central America. He writes, quote, "There are surely enough historical instances of the catastrophic downfall of entire peoples and cultures. Such declines were triggered by the collision of deficient and exhausted attitudes that were insufficient for continuance with those more recent, more intense, and in some respects, superior. One such occurrence vividly exemplifies the decisive nature of such crises, the collision of the magical, mythical, and unperspectival culture of the Central American Aztecs with the rational, technological, perspectival attitude of the 16th century Spanish conquistadors. A description of this event can be found in the Aztec Chronicle of Fray Bernardino de Hasagen, written 8 years after Cortez's conquest of Mexico on the basis of Aztec accounts. The following excerpts from the beginning of the 13th chapter of the Chronicle, which describes the conquest of Mexico City. The 13th chapter wherein is recounted how the Mexican king Montezuma sends other sorcerers who were to cast a spell on the Spanish and what happened to them on their way, and the second group of messengers, the soothsayers, the magicians, and the high priests likewise went to receive the Spanish. But it was to no avail. They could not bewitch the people, they could not reach their intent with the Spanish, they simply failed to arrive. There is hardly another text extant that describes so succinctly and so memorably the collapse of an entire world and a hitherto valid and effectual human attitude. The magical, mythical world of the Mexicans could not prevail against the Spaniards. It collapsed the moment it encountered the rational, technological mentality. The materialistic orientation of present-day Europeans will tend to attribute this collapse to the Spaniards' technological superiority, but in actual fact it was the vigor of the Spanish consciousness vis-a-vis the weakness of the Mexican that was decisive. It is the basic distinction between the egoless man bound to the group and a collective mentality and the individually securely conscious of his individuality. Authentic spellcasting, a fundamental element of the collective consciousness for the Mexicans, is effective only for the members attuned to the group consciousness. It simply bypasses those who are not bound to or sympathetic towards the group. The Spaniards' superiority, which compelled the Mexicans to surrender almost without a struggle, resulted primarily from their consciousness of individuality, not from their superior weaponry. Had it been possible for the Mexicans to step out of their egoless attitude, the Spanish victory would have been less certain and surely more difficult." End quote. In the same way, the 20th and 21st century present a demand for a new structure of consciousness, just as the Europeans had done to the Mexicans, while also, we don't often see the past ways of experiencing the world as having any authenticity. The tribesman, the Iron Age city dweller, the Greek cultist, they are all prototypes for the modern man. This is the Whig view of history. Mankind incarnates himself with the goal of becoming the democratic liberal he is today, and each phase of history is a stepping stone on the predetermined character arc of humanity. We conventionally see the modern man as emerging from a fog that blurred his vision of the world. His eyes aren't open, he is juvenile, frustrated, cursed with a set of archaic anxieties, and he must conceive things in a mythical and magical way. That is until the modern man steps above the fog and the world is made crystal clear. Man is made rational and is given perspective. To Gebser, this realization of ratio or rationality as man's highest faculty marks the formalizing of an evolution in the very structure of consciousness that begins to unfold with the ancient Greeks and culminates in modernity. This is not the first evolution of consciousness in human history. To Gebser, there have been 5 structures of consciousness. These structures are a shared lens for interpreting what is most essential, and Gebser's 5 structures of consciousness include the archaic, the magical, the mythical, the mental or rational, also known as the perspectival, contrasted by the last three, which are unperspectival, and then the integral, which is also known as aperspectival. These structures don't shift from one to the other like rounds in the chamber of a revolver. Instead, each consciousness structure is the aggregate of all preceding structures, and the unnecessary privileging of one above the other, the escaping of valency between them, results not only in a sort of lived inauthenticity, but the possibility for collapse. The structures aren't isolated, but are interconnected, and all the prior structures can be found in the subsequent ones. The structure of consciousness we will turn our attention to is the mental or rational consciousness, the apologetics of which have most loudly announced themselves as scientism, and expresses the view that all things will eventually be brought into the gaze of the scientific method, or even that the only meaningful questions are scientific ones. It is my contention that the scientistic and ratio worshipping are like any esoteric clairvoyant, subject to a theoretical matrix that, like any religion, has a metaphysical agreement on entities as they exist most essentially. That is to say, it is premised on something entirely unscientific. Take the statement, "We are just gene machines." This is a metaphysical statement that is a misappropriation of the tools given to us by science. There is no data sheet that can prove this, there is no laboratory experiment, and so on. So, how could any concept or idea, such as that all formal questions are scientific questions, be given meaning scientifically? How do you scientifically prove the statement, "The only meaningful questions are scientific questions"? Not only is this self-defeating, but the operations and the methods they're contained in will never be able to escape and reflect upon themselves, because these things, these metaphysical statements, are not data points, but concepts. Ratio and science are fantastic things, but to privilege them to the role of a religion is something different entirely. So, laying out the basics of the rational consciousness structure, the ratio man is far more recent than many would think. Socrates roughly announces the beginning of this structure of consciousness as it expresses itself formally, but it doesn't really formalize itself until the Renaissance, and the earliest germs of such a structure occur around 10,000 BC, and it is one concerned with perspective, sometimes called perspectival consciousness. The ratio mind sees itself as separate and dewelded from its surroundings. Its consciousness exists as a subject that's being in its nature is unmolested by the things that exist exterior to it in the form of objects. Aristotle saw being as a matter of substance. The world is comprised of self-sufficient entities. Descartes saw us as essentially thinking substances. The context of a thing or what it does or is heading towards has nothing to do with what defines it. This is to say, the rational consciousness structure sees itself as separate from the things it is perceiving, and perception is thus a means of latching on to real-world reference. If we wanted to think of some counterexample to this view, Hubert Dreyfus, in his 2007 lecture on Heidegger's Being and Time, uses the example of the film The Gods Must Be Crazy. A Coke bottle falls from the sky and is discovered by a tribesman. It doesn't make sense, then, that the Coke bottle is separate from the context of the tribesman, and its Coke bottleness is discoverable to him by perception. In the film, they think the bottle is from the gods. It creates all this conflict as members of the tribe try to use it as a weapon, and so the main character goes to throw it off the edge of the world. But of course, to know what a Coke bottle is, it is not enough to have its substance, but you must have access to the Coke drinking social context. So to go back to ratio, we're not just talking about logical or reasonable thought, but a certain way of facing the world. To use generative anthropology's lens, we can think of a ratio society as a declarative culture, where everything must be explained in declarative language. From this, we see an obsession over things like artificial intelligence, where just like the declarative statement, which is a subject and a predicate, which is the linguistic equivalent to a substance and its properties vis-a-vis Aristotle, human beings are reduced to the same thing in the discipline of artificial intelligence. The artificial intelligence crowd believes that an AI put in the place of the African tribesman could see the thing having fell from the sky, see that its substance is a container or a bottle, see the properties of the substance like that it is hard and see-through, and having that subject-predicate understanding is enough to know what the Coke bottle is. So we can see ratio consciousness is most concerned with abstraction, but is an abstraction subject to a set of rules and prerogatives. The theme of my channel has really been that humanity's production of concepts is not context-free. Ratio and egoic perspectival consciousness shows its earliest seeds about 10,000 years ago, but it doesn't fully penetrate the mythical world and become fully opposed to it until quite recently. Some expressions of this evolution are the shift towards monotheism. With monotheism comes dogma instead of symbolism, and as we explained in the video on man and technics, there is this growing desire to master nature, to create a microcosm free from the forces of the universe that man can rule over as God. And it would be Faustian civilization that would truly perfect this with the introduction of dynamics with Newtonian physics that take the forces of nature and input them into machines. In this way, the machine is a spiritual necessity of ratio-based Faustian society. It is no accident that this is where the Industrial Revolution happened and that it never took off elsewhere. No other society had mastered the three-dimensional perspective of space. And so because it is three-dimensional, another hallmark of rational consciousness is the spatializing of time, the incarnating of time into space as to see time as an extended linear horizontal reality that we are moved through. Time is understood as quantity, not quality. This is disrespecting time as its own fourth dimension. Three-dimensional rational consciousness begins to be expressed around 1250 AD. This is easily exemplified by the erection of the first public clock in the courtyard of Westminster Palace in 1283 by Pope Sabinus. In the mythical, time is temporal, cyclical, or binary, and is expressed in phases like night and day, or the seasons, as well as the myths that represent them. It is only rational consciousness that sees time as chronological and conceptual. This incarnation of time into space is deeply problematic. The future is now inherently valued as progress, and so technology as an artifact of the future becomes a spiritual necessity that can bring us closer to the source of being by bringing us closer to the future. In the aperspectival integral consciousness, time is not something that extends along a chronological line that, like space, can be quantified and is moved through linearly by the subject. So, this dichotomy between subject and object is based on the principle of oppositions that the ratio mind has inherited from mythical consciousness. So just as the mythical man sees a lunar god opposed by a sun god, in our mind, the sun and the moon are readily available to us as opposites, yet in modern heliocentric celestial order they certainly aren't. There is a god of fertility and a god of loyalty, or in the case of a horned being such as Baphomet or Cernunnos, the opposites are incarnated into the same entity, but the binary is symbolized nonetheless. There is a divine realm opposed by an earthly realm, left-hand path and a right-hand path. Mythical consciousness after the Neolithic expresses itself in such a way that we first see men and women symbolically represented as different entities, while before their roles were far more interchangeable. Warrior cults enter the scene, and circumcision begins as a bloodletting ritual to oppose male genitals to female genitals. So when there is myth, there is always a counter-myth. In many ways, this semiotic necessity for pairs of opposites is the greatest myth of them all, and the rational mind isn't entirely liberated by its confines. Myth is concerned with symbols that capture moods and impulses. It isn't concerned with results or collecting data, but fashioning existence as to see the world as creation, while just as the rational consciousness knows a perfect subject and thus thinks in individual terms. The mythical consciousness is collectivist and thinks about man as an aggregate. In Magian times, the universe is understood as a cavern, a dark cave that represents closedness, the Faustian master's perspective through exiting the cavern that manifests itself most obviously via this closed system of Christianity. This represents the gradual nature of the evolution of consciousness after the archaic awakening that we will be getting to. So in rational consciousness, we are coming out of the heavens and into the earth. For instance, in the Renaissance, artists begin painting backgrounds as opposed to the black cavernous space that was there before. Divine entities are painted with different sizes in proportion to their sacrality, as to see the divine become subject to perspective. The vertical canvas that represents a pointing upwards into the heavens is disfavored for the horizontal that represents the horizons of this earth, and so on. The mythical and the rational thus find themselves at odds. The mythical mind is creative and not restricted to quantities, while the rational mind is egoic, sees without colour, and breaks things down into quantities. This opposition can be understood via the interpretation of ancient societies as being proto-versions of ratio-oriented or declarative society. I could use astronomy as an example. I think the celestial bodies of our day through astronomy share a line of flight with the ancient Greeks and the Romans. They are both framings of cosmology that are authentic in their own ways. Consider if we named the planets George Washington, Elizabeth, or Victoria, it would be extremely arrogant, as if to say the Greek cosmology of our predecessors were just a waste of time. Just a failed attempt at what only modern Western man could do, which is astronomy. So most people could probably see the naming of the cosmos after what our Greek ancestors had understood about it as the bringing down of ratio to the side of mythical consciousness. But if we linearly trace back, we can see each structure as the laying of added complexities to the same attitudes, lightings, and perceptual apparatuses of their predecessors. So mythical consciousness arises about 40,000 years ago. It is here that symbolic matrices evolve, paralleling what we would call a religion or mythology. We had said before that the mythical mind is concerned with binaries, and so it can be said that this structure is two-dimensional. Before myth, man didn't know himself as opposed to others. His consciousness was one-dimensional, but now he is beginning to individuate himself, although he wouldn't master this individuation until he learnt ratio. But in an unperspectival way, man is becoming separate from nature. For the next tens of thousands of years, mankind produces all these wonderful mythologies, many of which having a story such as Genesis, the myth of Prometheus, or other tales that show man as being separate to the natural world and having some unique task given to him. Before myth, there were feelings, but now there is creativity that puts those feelings into words, images, and symbols. Each of them have meanings that change with new generations of myth, and their production isn't a rational process. Instead, these images are produced like how we would see things in our dreams. So afterlives and souls would also gain much more importance in this period. Ancient Egypt is an example of a civilization that was completely constituted on these themes. The Rosicrucian esotericists of the 17th century would talk of descending back into Egypt in order to revive our mythical consciousness. American esotericists, Freemasons, the Rosicrucian order, they're all alchemists and hermetics, two practices that are particularly concerned with the production of pairs of opposites, Mercury and Sulfur, spirit and form, above and below. This is a theme of mythical consciousness. So likewise, ancient Egypt was split into South Egypt and North Egypt, the north being associated with the color black, representing the fertile soil of the Nile, and the south being associated with the color red, representing the desert, while the north worshipped Horus and the south worshipped Set. In this way, Egypt was a particularly formalized mythical society where the trends in mythical thinking were inscribed in stone, metaphorically speaking. So we have spoken about the mythical structure separating man from nature, but still not fully developing the I against the we, or in other words, the ego. However, the magical consciousness structure before myth is even less egoic. It doesn't restrict the world to binaries, but works the world and its seemingly unrelated parts into an all-encompassing meshwork. It is solely one-dimensional. Think about the Dreamtime stories of Aboriginal culture. The indigenous rainbow serpent gives life, but also takes it away, and the entity exists everywhere. British anthropologists will try to understand this magical entity in the same way they understand the mythical beings of Norse or Greek mythology as representing cycles and binaries, but really, the rainbow serpent is a meshwork or multiplicity connecting everything past, present, and future. So the magical consciousness is egoless, it is spaceless and timeless, and this insight would influence the modern idea of time and space as illusions as made demonstrable in Einsteinian physics. And magical consciousness sees the world as a multiplicity, a connectivity of point-like unity. And so, Gebser writes that it is here that language emerges, it is here that rituals and prayer enter the scene. The theme to Gebser is a reaction to nature. Man weaves nature into a one-dimensional unity that he begins an intimate association with. In fact, he isn't yet separate from nature at all. Man doesn't know himself as separate from the animals and plants. Magic is in fact defined here as doing without knowing. This is the way magical man lives. At this stage, the collective spends its day hunting and gathering, surviving. Then at the end of the day, the tribe gathers around the fire and reflects. In this way, memory is collective, and the inscribing of life into speech takes a collective experience. So the magical consciousness structure has no ego, it has no I, only a we. It is like a dream, everything interweaves into each other like a colourful meshwork, unlike the waking man who knows who he is and has formal knowledge of his own relation to everything else. Using an example from Leo Friobenius' book, Unknown Africa, Gebser writes, quote, "Members of the hunting tribe of pygmies, 3 men and a woman, draw a picture of an antelope in the sand before they started out at dawn to hunt antelopes. With the first ray of sunlight that fell on the sand, they intended to kill the antelope. Their first arrow hit the drawing unerringly in the neck, then they went out to hunt and returned with a slain antelope. Their death-dealing arrow hit the animal in exactly the same spot where hours before the other arrow had hit the drawing, having fulfilled its magic purpose. This arrow was then removed from the drawing with an accompanying ritual designed to ward off any evil consequences of the murder from the hunters. After that was done, the drawing itself was erased. Several characteristics of the magic structure are illustrated by this scene. The egolessness is expressed first of all in the fact that the responsibility for the murder committed by the group ego against a part of nature is attributed to a power already felt to be standing outside, the sun. It is not the pygmy's arrow that kills, but the first arrow of the sun that falls on the animal, and of which the real arrow is only a symbol. Nowadays, of course, one would interpret it just the other way around, and say the sun's ray is a symbol of the arrow. But this linking of the responsibility of the hunter's group ego, assuming the form of 4 human beings performing the rite with the sun, which, because of its brightness, must be considered a symbol of consciousness, it is clear to what extent the capacity for consciousness of these human beings is still on the outside or connected with the outside. With the pygmies, in their egolessness, the moral consciousness that they must bear responsibility deriving from a clearly conscious ego is still attributed to the sun. Their ego, and with it an essential part of their soul, is still scattered over the world like the light of the sun. This leads us directly to the second characteristic, point-like unity. This is expressed in the visible interchangeability of the real and the symbolic causative events, that is, in equating the ray of sunlight and the arrow. At the basis of this point-like unity lies a natural vital nexus, not a rational causal one. This point-related unity, in which each and everything intertwines and is interchangeable, becomes apparent when the symbolic murder in a rite performed by a hunt coincides exactly with the actual one committed by the hunter. In the spacelessness and timeless world of the magic structure, this constitutes a working unity which operates without a causal nexus, end quote. Now, predating the magical is the most simple form of human consciousness, and that is the archaic, which is ironically one of the most difficult to understand. And Gebser sees it as beginning even before modern Homo sapiens, and it is very instinctual and dim. The archaic consciousness is closest to the ever-present origin, a concept that the book is titled after. The word archaic comes from the Greek word arche, which literally means origin. The origin refers to the awakening from the deep time of the unconceptualized, unsymbolic, humanity-absent earth that serves as the bedrock for being. It is timeless and is antecedent to any way we might perceive time and whatever culture we might look to. If the magical is one of one-dimensional consciousness, the archaic is zero-dimensional consciousness. There is no perspectivity. Notions of infinity, where eternity is made a destination, journeys into underworlds, the inferno. These myths are means of traveling into the archaic. This is to say, we never move beyond the archaic. This is impossible. Instead, what changes is the relationship human consciousness has to the world as it is mediated by perception. The origin that brings forth this most latent form of consciousness is the source from which all other things spring from. There are very little records to say anything about this state of consciousness. Also, man is still largely a part of nature, and his microcosm that perfects itself in the urbanized cityscape hasn't even a germ of itself yet, so the future is solely potentiality at this point. And Gebser says it can be likened to a dimly lit mist devoid of shadows, like a deep sleep. It is zero-dimensional, there is nothing particular to it, it's just there, and is completely different to how we experience consciousness today. So now let's discuss the fifth and final structure, integral consciousness. The aperspectival. This involves the relativization of the last consciousness structures. The rational is egoic and perspectival, while the integral is post-egoic and aperspectival. The rational is concerned with parts, while the integral is concerned with the whole, meaning it has diaphaneity. This doesn't mean the integral negates the rational, but it deterritorializes it and removes it from its regime by which all things are brought into its control. You can think about aperspectivity being similar to the term amoral's positioning to the binary of moral and immoral. It denotes something outside the binary. It is the main current underlying postmodern thought that, despite its hostility from the more egoic older generations, will be an early germ of a new evolution in human consciousness in the next generations. So there's a lot of elitism to Gebser's work. The perspectival age is mostly moved by elites who have this perspectival consciousness, while most other people, similar to the NPC meme, don't actually construct an egoic consciousness. So nevertheless, to talk of a post-egoic consciousness like the integral is a difficult task. We have hinted at how Gebser sees us living out each of the structures of consciousness every day throughout the cycle of waking and sleeping. In this instance, the archaic is a perfect dreamless sleep, while the integral represents a full awakening, almost like a modern equivalent to the Eastern notions of transcendence that had never quite paralleled in the West. Rational consciousness is three-dimensional, while the integral is the transcending of the confines of three-dimensionality that is solely concerned with space. The integral rises above the binary of subject and object and is four-dimensional, the fourth dimension being time. Time is made qualitative, time is ever-present, time is an intensity of experience, time is a part of the collective being of man that is not becoming to anywhere because it never set out with a goal or destination that could make its closest source of being a quantitative destination in time. Instead, Time is a shifting intensity along experience, while the tensions and relations between things are made more important than the things themselves in a perspectivity. The question of which ideology is right becomes less important than the question of how do ideologies live together and interact. Unlike in the archaic structure, when the future is pure potential, in the integral, man's spiritual potential has been actualized. But what is worth focusing on is the conjoining or fitting together of parts into integrality. This is what Gebser calls systasis, which describes an approach beyond the systematization of rational consciousness. Instead of looking at parts, we look at the whole. To use a political example, instead of looking at which ideology is correct in the wake of this new era of globalization, we should look at how ideologies can live together and have their resentments mitigated. Think about being a conservative or progressive commentator, being Ben Shapiro, just rallying up supporters while your left-wing counterparts do the same. You will never win. The left will never go away. This approach has clearly exhausted its usefulness because today it seems no one can rally around a single world vision like they could in the past. Instead, we should look at the resentments of conservatives and leftists and their base and figure out how to mitigate them. That is one simple example. And doing this would give us all a far better understanding of leftism and conservatism to begin with, because it has been liberated from the colonial gaze of perspectivity that sees competing perspectives as absurdities. What integral consciousness is concerned with is integrating, is arranging intensities in the correct way. Some people might respond by asking, well, don't you want fair pay for women, immigration control, these desired ideological outcomes, to go back with the political example? Well, this is the realization that integral consciousness is concerned with process rather than the result. To continue the politics example, an integral approach sees society as a process rather than a set of products, like good or bad policies that can be substituted with other products if one chooses to, which is never how it works. Consider Ben Shapiro again. It's an endless battle resultant from the neglected demand for integral consciousness. Likewise, a trait of perspectival consciousness that must be relativized is the idea of scientism. It is no doubt that the greatest celebration of ratio has been science and technology. To Gebser, the rational consciousness is not synonymous with logical or sensible thought, as we have said, but it is when man is no longer motivated by things larger than himself. It is the collapsing of the vertical. In a word, he becomes egoic, while Georg Feuerstein describes scientism as a straitjacket for the mind that deprives it of its full and most actualized state. Scientism describes the projecting of science onto a mythological framework. Science is made a religious matrix by which no human affairs can escape. Feuerstein, talking about Gebser, explains that metaphysics, ethics, and those disciplines conventionally agreed upon as outside the competence of science under scientism are forced into its confines. This is to say, scientism is the misuse of the tools inherent to the structure of rational consciousness as to suppress all other forms of consciousness. And Feuerstein specifically says that the scientific worldview is not only grey and depressing, but evolutionarily unviable, and sees the destruction of the environment, the plagues of nuclear warfare, and the full capacity of what this Earth can take from us being brought to the closest horizons. So Gebser describes the span of time between now and this cataclysmic event he has predicted as determined by an increase in technological feasibility inversely proportional to man's sense of responsibility. Instead, we must assimilate the entirety of our human awareness into our existence, become aware of the passing forms of understanding and which ones have become exhausted. But anyway guys, that's going to have to do it for this video. This was a long one, and thank you all for sticking around listening. If you valued this video and gained some insights from it, then please consider donating to me on Patreon. It means a lot, and catch you guys later.